The drone fits through the opening with inches to spare. And then the feed cuts to black. Not a malfunction. The cave just swallowed the light. Jacob's Well sits in the Texas Hill Country looking like nothing more than a hole in a creek bed. 8 feet wide at the surface. A swimmer could circle the rim in seconds. But the moment that drone pushes past the lip and descends, something changes. Because the walls don't close in, they open. The cave below is large enough to hide a house, maybe 2, and it keeps going in directions that don't make sense on a map. Scientists who reviewed the footage used a word you don't often hear from trained researchers: terrified. Not surprised, not puzzled. Terrified. That's the thing that won't let go. This is a spring in central Texas, not a deep ocean trench, not some uncharted Antarctic chasm. People swim here. People have died here more than anywhere else in the state. And the drone is now showing exactly why, revealing something in those submerged chambers that no diver's light ever caught clearly enough to explain. What it found is stranger than the death toll ever suggested. The name alone sounds harmless. Jacob's Well. It conjures something pastoral. A stone rim, a rope, a bucket. The kind of place a family stops on a road trip through the hill country, snaps a photo, maybe lets the kids wade in. And for decades, that's exactly what it was. A swimming hole. A summer destination. Locals have been jumping into that 8-foot opening since at least the 1850s, when European settlers named it after the biblical well and marveled at the cold, clear water pushing up from below. But the pastoral image has a body count. At least 8 divers have died inside Jacob's Well. 8 confirmed. And several of them were never brought back out. They are still in there. Somewhere in those chambers, the drone is only now beginning to map. The first recorded diving death happened in 1979. Then another, spaced across the decades with enough distance between them that each one could almost be written off as a tragic accident, a one-off, a matter of bad luck. But the deaths kept coming. Experienced divers, people who knew cave systems, who had trained for exactly this kind of dive. That's the detail that doesn't resolve cleanly. These weren't tourists who jumped in not knowing what lay beneath. Some were certified cave divers, carrying the right equipment, following the right protocols. And they still didn't come back out. So the question that the drone footage forced back into focus, the one scientists and diving safety experts have been circling for 40 years, is why. Why does this specific hole, in this specific creek bed in central Texas, keep killing people who know exactly what they're doing? The answer starts about 200 feet below the Texas Hill Country, in rock that formed when this entire region was the floor of a shallow inland sea. The Edwards Aquifer, one of the most productive freshwater aquifers in North America, runs through a belt of Cretaceous limestone that the ocean laid down roughly 100 million years ago. When the sea retreated, it left behind calcium carbonate rock shot through with tiny pores. Over millions of years, slightly acidic rainwater filtered down, dissolved those pores into fissures, dissolved fissures into voids, and dissolved voids into chambers. Karst terrain. The hill country is essentially Swiss cheese at depth, and Jacob's Well is one place where the ceiling of that cheese broke open. But here is what the drone footage confirmed, and what makes this particular hole different from a simple vertical shaft. The cave doesn't go straight down. Within the first chamber, maybe 30 feet beneath the surface, the passage turns. Hard. It cuts sideways through the limestone in directions that have almost nothing to do with the creek bed sitting above it. The geology underneath does not follow the geography on top. That inversion is the trap. A diver descending expects gravity to be the organizing principle. Deeper means down, shallower means up. In Jacob's Well, that intuition is wrong almost immediately. And that's the mechanical answer to the question the previous deaths raised. Trained divers were following correct procedure for a vertical cave. They were inside a horizontal one, but the geometry of the passages is only part of the story, because the full map of this system, how far it runs, how many chambers branch off the main channel, whether anyone has ever reached the end, that question is still open. So the map matters, and the drone gave us one, not complete, not definitive, but the clearest picture anyone has managed without putting a human being at risk. 4 chambers, each one a different way to die. The first chamber is the one that answers the orientation question. The passage cranks sideways. The ambient light from the surface disappears behind the angle of the turn, and suddenly a diver is navigating by feel and instrumentation in a space that looks, on a dive computer, like it should be simple. It isn't. The silt on the floor is years of accumulated fine particulate, disturbed by the slightest fin stroke, and it rises like smoke. Visibility drops from 10 feet to 0 in under a minute. That's where the pattern breaks down. A diver who stirs the silt on the way in will navigate home through a cloud of their own making. The second chamber opens wider, which is deceptive. Space reads as safety underwater. It isn't. Wider means more silt, more surface area to disturb, more ways to get turned around when your reference points vanish. The third chamber is the one that ends most attempts. The passage pinches to a restriction, not a gradual narrowing, a sudden one. A diver has to exhale completely, deflate their lungs to their absolute minimum, and push through a gap barely wider than their shoulders while their tank drags against limestone 50 feet underwater, in zero visibility, with no room to turn around. One wrong breath and they are wedged. Nobody has reliably documented what lies past the fourth chamber. That question is still open, and it may stay that way. But the answer to why trained divers keep returning to the same stretch of passage and not coming back is already visible in the first three. So that restriction, the one that has to be exhaled through, squeezed through, survived, became the effective end of human exploration, not because nobody tried to push past it. Because the math on the other side of that gap doesn't favor a person. The team that changed that didn't send another diver, they sent a machine. The remotely operated vehicle they chose is small, genuinely small, not compact for a submarine small. Its hull is narrow enough to thread through the third chamber restriction without deflating anything, without a heartbeat, without the margin of error problem that makes that passage a gamble every single time. It was the first instrument of any kind to pass that point without a human pilot attached to it. What that means, practically, is this. Everything past the third chamber has existed in a kind of enforced darkness, not just unfilmed, structurally unreachable by any eyes that need oxygen and a pulse to keep working. The ROV doesn't need either. The question it carried through that restriction is the same one every diver who ever suited up at Jacob's Well was carrying. What is actually down there? What does the passage open into, if it opens at all? Is there a fourth chamber, a fifth, or does the cave simply stop? Nobody had reliably come back with an answer. Now something that can't die trying was about to find out. The drone broke the surface and kept going. That question, what is actually down there, was about to get its first real answer in decades of attempts. The first chamber opens immediately below the entry tube, and anyone who has read the old survey maps would recognize its general shape, a rough oval roughly 6 meters across, walls of Cretaceous limestone pressing in from every side. But the maps were drawn from memory, by divers working with failing lights and burning lungs. The drone had neither problem. What it caught in the first seconds of steady footage was something no survey had ever noted. The walls aren't bare rock, they're coated almost completely in a pale ghostly film. Not sediment, not mineral residue. Biologists who reviewed the footage identified it as a living biofilm, dense communities of microorganisms colonizing stone that sits well below the photic zone, in water that carries almost no organic material down from the surface. Living, in there, where nothing should have enough to eat. The second chamber, deeper and tighter, showed the same coating, if anything thicker toward the floor, which forces a question nobody had thought to ask before the drone made it irrelevant to wonder. If microbes are thriving this deep inside a near-sealed cave, something is feeding them, and if something is feeding them, Jacob's Well may not be an empty passage at all. It may be a working ecosystem. The question is what sits at the top of it. The top of that ecosystem is still 3 meters ahead, but the drone never gets there cleanly. At the transition point between the second and third chambers, where the passage pinches and the floor rises sharply, the thruster wash catches decades of undisturbed silt and detonates it. One frame the feed is clear, the next it's white. Not dark, white. A solid wall of suspended sediment so fine it doesn't settle. It just hangs there, filling every cubic inch the lights can reach. For nearly 4 minutes, the operators have no image at all, just the drone's depth telemetry ticking forward, and a video feed that looks like static from a dead channel. That whiteness is not a technical failure. It's a physics problem with a body count attached. This is precisely the mechanism that has killed divers in passages exactly like this one. Silt-out blindness, induced in seconds, inside a restriction where there is no room to turn around and no margin to wait it out. A diver who triggers that cloud is navigating by touch, by memory, and by whatever air remains in the tank. The drone has none of those problems. So the operators hold position, cut throttle to minimum, and wait. When the silt finally begins to settle and the feed comes back, the question is what the lights will find on the other side of that passage. The feed comes back in pieces. First a smear of light, then an edge, then the rock wall resolving out of the gray like a photograph developing in a dark room. The silt hasn't fully settled. There's still a faint haze, like fog at the edge of headlights. But it's clear enough. The drone is through the restriction, and then the walls disappear. Not because the lights failed, because there are no walls to find. The passage that had been squeezing tighter for the last 20 feet simply opens, and the space beyond it is enormous, roughly the size of a school gymnasium, 70 feet below the surface, in a stretch of Texas hill country where nobody had mapped anything like this. The drone's sonar sweeps the perimeter and the returns come back wrong. Too far, too wide. Scientists reviewing the telemetry later would use the word unexpected. What they meant was, this chamber had no reason to exist, and they had no record that it did. Every survey, every dive log, every chart of Jacob's well stops well before this point. Whatever the operators had assumed was down here. A narrowing passage, a terminal sump, a dead end. None of it prepared them for a room this size hiding past that restriction. The drone holds position at the threshold, lights sweeping slowly. And what nobody in that room could answer yet was the question the sonar was already asking, whether this chamber was the end of the cave or the beginning of something deeper. The drone pushes into the chamber, and the lights catch something on the ceiling that stops the surface team cold. Stalactites, dozens of them, hanging from the rock in clean tapered points, the kind of formation that takes thousands of years to build, one slow mineral drip at a time. The problem is that stalactites cannot form underwater. They require air. A stalactite grows because water drips through open space, deposits calcium carbonate, and retreats. Do that in a submerged passage and the chemistry breaks down entirely. You get nothing, which means at some point, some specific datable point in geological history, this chamber was dry. It sat above the water table, open to air, slowly building these formations over centuries or millennia. And then the water rose, or the land shifted, or the aquifer recharged past a threshold it had never crossed before, and the chamber flooded, sealed, preserved. The stalactites have been underwater ever since, intact, untouched, waiting in the dark for something with a light to find them. That single observation rewrites the timeline of the entire Edwards Aquifer system. When was this chamber dry? How long ago did the water table rise to claim it? And what does that mean for the millions of people in Central Texas who depend on that same aquifer today, who assume its behavior is something they understand? But those are questions that require time, analysis, samples. What the drone is answering right now is a simpler and more immediate one. What else is in this chamber that nobody has ever seen? The answer starts appearing on the chamber walls. As the drone sweeps its light across the limestone, the texture changes. Not the smooth dissolution surfaces of the upper passages, not the scalloped erosion from flowing water, something else, a pattern pressed into the rock itself, repeated, deliberate looking in the way that only biology produces. The researchers watching the feed recognize it immediately. Fossils, shells mostly. The coiled geometry of ancient marine organisms locked into the chamber walls at 60 feet below the surface of a landlocked Texas spring. Not one. Not a handful. Entire sections of wall dense with them, a record written before the rock was rock, when this limestone was still sediment settling on an ocean floor. These organisms died somewhere between 60 and 100 million years ago, when the region that would become Central Texas sat beneath a shallow inland sea called the Western Interior Seaway. The Cretaceous. Dinosaurs were still alive on the land above. That answers the question the previous observations forced open. This chamber was dry, fully exposed, open to air, at some point after this rock was laid down and before the aquifer rose to swallow it. The fossils fix a baseline. The dissolution features narrow the window. Geologists will spend months threading those constraints together into an actual date range. But the fossils raise something the sediment record alone never could. If ancient marine life is preserved this intact down here, what else might the cave have preserved? And is anything in these passages not fossil, not mineral, not dead? The answer to that question came on the drone's return pass. Not from the rock, not from the sediment, but from something in the water column itself. The footage shows a disturbance roughly a meter ahead of the drone, moving laterally and then down away from the light. Not silt. Silt disperses outward in a cloud. This moved with direction, with intention, not the drone's own wake. The current signature is wrong, and it appears several seconds before the drone reaches that position in the chamber. Here's what makes that significant. Cave-adapted fauna, troglodytic species, organisms that have spent so many generations in total darkness that they've lost pigmentation, often lost eyes, restructured their entire metabolisms around scarcity, have been documented at springs fed by the Edwards Aquifer, the same system Jacob's Well taps. Blind salamanders, isopods, amphipods with bodies like pale glass. The movement on the drone footage is consistent in scale and behavior with a large invertebrate, not a fish. Something slower, deliberate, retreating from the light. Microbes we already knew were down there. Biofilm communities, chemolithotrophs living on mineral gradients. Their presence was never in question. But a macroscopic animal, possibly undocumented, possibly endemic to this specific passage system, that changes the entire legal and scientific frame around Jacob's Well. A site with an undescribed species isn't just a geological curiosity, it's a habitat. And that raises a question the footage alone cannot answer. Does Jacob's Well harbor something living that science hasn't named yet? And if it does, what are we doing to it every summer when the swimmers arrive? That question, what are we doing to it every summer, lands differently once you understand what Jacob's Well actually is beneath the surface. Not just a cave, not just a dive site, a valve in one of the most critical water systems in central Texas. The Edwards Aquifer stretches across roughly 3,600 square miles of the Texas Hill Country, supplying drinking water to more than 2 million people. San Antonio draws from it. Austin's western suburbs draw from it. Dozens of smaller communities between them draw from it. Jacob's Well sits at one of the aquifer's primary recharge zones, a place where surface water drops directly into the underground network, and where aquifer pressure pushes water back up to the surface as a spring. It is simultaneously an intake and an exhaust port. In 2011, during the worst single-year drought in Texas recorded history, Jacob's Well stopped flowing entirely. For the first time anyone had documented, the spring went dry. What had been a constant upwelling for centuries simply stopped. That wasn't a warning sign. It was the warning sign in the plainest possible language the aquifer could speak. The drone footage gives scientists something they didn't have before 2011, a view from inside the system during stress. The passage geometry, the sediment behavior, the water clarity at depth, all of it carries information about how the aquifer is moving or failing to move right now. What does that footage tell them about the system's health? And what does that mean for every community downstream whose tap water runs through this rock? The footage answers that question, but not in a way that offers comfort. What scientists found when they analyzed the flow patterns wasn't a simple picture of water moving steadily downward through rock. It was something stranger and more precarious. Under normal conditions, Jacob's Well pushes water upward with consistent pressure. That's the classic artesian behavior, the system in balance. But the drone footage captured something the 2011 drought had hinted at, and nobody wanted to confirm. Under specific surface conditions, when recharge slows and withdrawal spikes simultaneously, the directional pressure inside the cave inverts. The flow reverses. That matters enormously. A spring that flows outward is a natural barrier. Pressure keeps surface contaminants from being pulled in. A spring whose flow reverses is the opposite. It becomes a drain. Anything sitting in the surrounding soil or entering the aquifer upstream, agricultural runoff, septic leachate, development-related pollutants, can be actively pulled back through Jacob's Well and into the water supply instead of being pushed away from it. The aquifer isn't just vulnerable to contamination during reversal events. It's a pump moving the wrong direction at exactly the moments the system is already under the most stress. which raises the question the drone footage leaves deliberately open. What is already in it? And how often has the reversal been happening without anyone watching? Here is what the drone footage actually mapped: a cave system with documented connections stretching miles beyond the visible spring. Fractures, conduits, and secondary passages feeding into the same Trinity Aquifer that supplies drinking water to tens of thousands of people across the Texas Hill Country. Not an isolated hole in a creek bed, a window into a living, breathing underground network. And that network has no filter. Water entering a sinkhole 2 miles away travels underground, fast by groundwater standards, and arrives at Jacob's Well carrying whatever it picked up along the way. Lawn chemicals, agricultural runoff, septic leach. The limestone karst doesn't scrub it, it pipelines it, which brings us to the finding that stopped researchers cold. Pesticide and herbicide compounds have been detected in Jacob's Well water. Chemicals with no natural source anywhere near the spring basin itself. There is only one explanation. They entered the aquifer somewhere upstream, traveled through underground conduit, and emerged here. The distance between surface contamination and the spring is not a barrier. It's a commute. So the question the drone footage forces into the open is not abstract. How vulnerable is this aquifer to contamination? Completely. It has no protective clay layer above it, no meaningful filtration path. What falls on the surface eventually arrives below it, often within days, sometimes within hours during a heavy rain, which leaves the harder question still unanswered. Is there any way to protect it? And at what point does the damage become permanent? The answer as of now is partial. Hays County acquired Jacob's Well and the land surrounding it as a natural area in 2010. No more private development on the immediate property. No more unrestricted access. On paper, that sounds like protection. On the ground, it looks like a visitor center and a reservation system that caps daily swimmers at a few dozen people. But here is the thing that reframes what protection even means at this site. Swimming at Jacob's Well was banned entirely for several years. Not because of drowning risk, not because of current or depth, because human sunscreen and body chemistry were measurably altering the spring's water chemistry. The concentrations of chemicals entering the water column from a single afternoon of swimmers were detectable, not theoretical, measured. That is how sensitive this system is. A body in the water is not a neutral presence. And if a few dozen swimmers in a season can shift the chemistry of the spring, the drone footage forces an uncomfortable reckoning with scale. Because the threat to the aquifer is not coming from inside the natural area. It is coming from the watershed above it. Tens of thousands of acres of land where the rules are different, where development continues, where impervious cover is climbing every year, which opens the question that will define this spring's future. Can Jacob's Well survive the pressure now being placed on it? And if it cannot, what does the failure of that spring mean for the 250,000 people whose water it helps supply? That question, whether Jacob's Well can survive what is now bearing down on it, is precisely what the scientists who analyzed the drone footage have been trying to answer. And their answer is not a reassurance. It is a call to action. The expedition generated something rare in regional conservation disputes: a working consensus across hydrology, biology, and cave science. The researchers are aligned on 3 immediate needs. First, return ROV surveys. More systematic, better instrumented, mapping the passages the first drone could only glimpse. Second, biological sampling from the water column and the cave walls, to establish a baseline before further degradation makes the baseline impossible to reconstruct. Third, and most consequentially, a federally recognized protection status for the spring itself, one with teeth, jurisdiction that extends upstream into the recharge zone, not just a boundary drawn around the pool. Because here is what one hydrologist on the project made clear. The cave system is almost certainly larger than anything the drone documented. The passages continue beyond where the tether ran out. The drone reached its limit, not the caves. What lies in those unmapped chambers? What species? What formations? What hydrological connections? Nobody knows yet. Whether anyone finds out depends entirely on decisions being made right now, above ground, by people who may never have looked into this water at all. The passages continue. That's what the hydrologist said, and it's what the data keeps insisting. But here is the detail that changed the conversation in the weeks after the drone was recovered. The one finding that reframed everything documented before it. Sonar mapping of the outer reaches of Jacob's Well. run along the bedrock at the edge of the tether's range, suggests a fifth chamber, not a widening of the fourth. A distinct space, separated by a constriction the drone couldn't pass. And the water flowing out of it, measurable, traceable, is colder than anything recorded in the 4 chambers the drone actually reached. Measurably colder, which means its origin is deeper. The thermal signature of deep groundwater, pulled up from a source the drone never saw. That single data point, a temperature reading at the edge of a sonar return, implies a vertical drop or a lateral reach, or both, that dwarfs what was mapped. The system doesn't end at the drone's limit. It begins again there. So what is Jacob's Well? Finally, a swimming hole where teenagers have always jumped in on summer afternoons? A death trap that has taken trained divers? A scientific archive written in limestone and cold water, still mostly unread? Or something the existing categories don't quite hold? The answer is sitting in the dark, a few hundred feet past where the tether ran out. The temperature reading at the edge of the sonar return, that's where the real terror lives. Not in the footage of the formations, not in the darkness of the 4th chamber, not even in the names carved into the restriction walls by divers who didn't come back. The terror is structural, it's epistemological. What the drone found wasn't an answer. It was a proof that the question is larger than anyone assumed. And Jacob's Well is one spring. One named, studied, photographed, repeatedly dived system in a single county in central Texas, sitting beneath a town, beneath a swimming hole where families spread towels on summer afternoons, which forces the question that nobody in that research team could quite let go of afterward. How many others are there? How many systems like this? Chambers stacked on chambers, thermals rising from depths no instrument has reached, water emerging from sources nobody has mapped, exist beneath populated land, beneath cities, beneath aquifers entire regions drink from, and we simply don't know because we haven't sent anything in to look. Jacob's Well terrifies scientists not because of what the drone found, it terrifies them because of what finding it implies about everything that hasn't been found yet. The most unsettling frame in the entire footage isn't a formation or a strange current. It's the final shot, the drone's camera tilted back up through the restriction toward the surface, where daylight has compressed to a circle 8 feet wide, impossibly distant. That circle is everything humanity has ever seen of this place. The rest is still dark,